On Sunday, the 26th of May, 1844, a month before his untimely death, Joseph Smith spoke to a large congregation in Nauvoo, Illinois, and strongly and flatly denied rumors that he was secretly practicing polygamy. What a thing it is for a man to be accused of committing adultery and having 7 wives when I can only find one. I am the same man, and as innocent as I was 14 years ago, and I can prove them all perjurers. In fact, however, Joseph Smith married at least 33 women in addition to Emma Hale, his first and only legal wife, and possibly 10 to 30 others not well documented. Most of these marriages occurred from April 1841 to November 1843, which is about 1 additional wife per month. The youngest was 14 and the oldest 58, the average age being 30. 10 were teenagers, 9 were in their 20s, 9 were in their 30s, 1 was in her 40s, and 4 were in their 50s. There were 3 sets of sisters, Zina and Presendia Huntington, Emily and Eliza Partridge, and Sarah and Maria Lawrence, and 1 mother and daughter, Patty and Sylvia Sessions. Even more surprising are the 14 women who were already married at the time Joseph Smith married them, which is the subject of this video. Naturally, much discussion of Joseph Smith's polygamy has centered on these 14 women and their polyandrous marriages to Joseph Smith. Polyandry refers to a woman with more than one husband. However, while Joseph Smith's marrying other men's wives was technically polyandry, there was no thought of establishing a formal system of polyandrous marriage in Nauvoo, such as might be found in ancient Tibet or today in parts of India, Nepal, and Africa. The polyandry I will be discussing is only incidental to Joseph Smith's marrying other men's wives. While all of Joseph Smith's plural marriages had life-altering consequences, his intruding into the lives of married couples, even newlyweds, is most troubling. Mormon apologists have tried to defend Joseph Smith by arguing that most of these polyandrous marriages were merely ceremonial and intended for the next life only. Moreover, they argue, in the few cases where Joseph Smith had sexual privileges, there was no sexual polyandry, since the women had discontinued having sex with their legal husbands. That's right. In the first of a 2-part video, I will discuss the case of Sylvia Sessions Lyon, who believed that her daughter, Josephine, was the biological daughter of Joseph Smith, but through DNA was recently disproved. This turn of events has turned out to be the best evidence for sexual polyandry. In a second video, I will discuss the other polyandrous wives of Joseph Smith. Shortly after her family's conversion to Mormonism, 19-year-old Sylvia Sessions married WINDSOR Lyon on the 21st of April, 1838, at Far West, Missouri. Joseph Smith performed the ceremony. 4 years later, 23-year-old Sylvia, the mother of 2 children, was sealed to Joseph Smith in Nauvoo, probably about February 1842. On the 9th of March, she witnessed the polyandrous marriage of her 47-year-old mother, Patty Sessions, to Smith. When her daughter Josephine was born, on the 8th of February, 1844, Sylvia believed Joseph Smith was the father, rather than her legal husband, WINDSOR. However, Sylvia kept this to herself, not even telling Josephine until on her deathbed in 1882. Years later in Utah, Assistant Church Historian Andrew Jensen obtained a statement from the 71-year-old Josephine, which she signed on the 24th of February, 1915. Just prior to my mother's death in 1882, she called me to her bedside and told me that her days on earth were about numbered, and before she passed away from mortality, she desired to tell me something which she had kept as an entire secret from me and from all others, but which she now desired to communicate to me. She then told me that I was the daughter of the prophet Joseph Smith, she having been sealed to the prophet at the time that her husband, Mr. Lyon, was out of fellowship with the church. She also told me that she was sealed to the prophet about the same time that Zina D. Huntington and Eliza R. Snow were thus sealed. In conclusion, Mother told me not to make her statement to me too public, as it might cause trouble and arouse unpleasant curiosity. I have followed her advice, and I am relating the facts today, practically the first time, responding to the request or desire of one of the assistant church historians. Whether or not Josephine was Joseph Smith's biological daughter, Sylvia's belief was based on the fact that she had sex with Smith while being married to Windsor. Some apologists have tried to escape this evidence for sexual polyandry by suggesting that it is unclear about what is meant to be a daughter of Joseph Smith, and therefore Sylvia may have told Josephine that she was a spiritual or adopted daughter of Joseph Smith, having been born under the covenant of an eternity-only sealing. This argument was so weak that even Brian C. Hales, the chief proponent of the non-sexual no polyandry interpretation, easily dismissed it in his path-breaking 3-volume examination of Joseph Smith's polygamy, published in 2013, stating, "If no biological connection existed between Josephine and Joseph Smith, it is strange that Sylvia would wait until her deathbed to dramatically reveal to Josephine that the prophet was her father only in eternity. To be sealed as one of his descendants was unexceptional. It conferred no unique or unusual status, required no special deathbed announcement, had no reason to be kept secret during most of the child's lifetime, and would not have been a matter of interest to church historians." This was similar to the assessment of polygamy historian Daniel W. Bachman, who said in his 1975 dissertation, "The desire for secrecy, as well as the delicacy of the situation, assure us that Mrs. Sessions was not merely explaining to her daughter that she was Smith's child by virtue of a temple sealing. The plain inference arising from Jensen's curiosity in the matter and Mrs. Josephine Fisher's remarks is that she was, in fact, the offspring of Joseph Smith." Jensen's belief that Josephine was the literal daughter of Joseph Smith is apparent in his introduction to her statement, where he refers to Windsor Lyon, her mother's husband, rather than Josephine's father. Even the text of Josephine's affidavit refers to Windsor as Sylvia's husband, Mr. Lyon. There is no way to interpret this document other than Josephine claiming she was Joseph Smith's biological daughter. Any interpretation that does not acknowledge this fact is going to be wrong. The secret of Josephine's paternity soon spread following Sylvia's death in 1882. 6 years after Josephine learned her true paternity, George H. Brimmel, future president of Brigham Young University, recorded in his journal, "Went to Spanish Fork. Evening, had a talk with Father Hales, who told me that it was said that Joseph Smith had a daughter named Josephine living in Bountiful, Utah. Similarly, Salt Lake City Stake President Angus M. Cannon told Joseph Smith III, who was visiting Utah in 1905 and doubted his father lived polygamy. I will now refer you to one case where it was said by the girl's grandmother that your father, Joseph Smith, has a daughter born of a plural wife. The girl's grandmother was Mother Patty Sessions, who lived in Nauvoo and died here in the valley in 1892. She was the granddaughter of Mother Sessions. That girl, I believe, is living today in Bountiful, north of this city. These accounts reveal how Josephine's paternity was understood and why it was sought by Jensen. This evidence for sexual polyandry was considered so strong that few interpreters tried to overturn it. Instead, apologists tried to argue that Windsor and Sylvia were separated or divorced, or that Joseph Smith's sealing to Sylvia nullified the first marriage, and therefore this is a case of consecutive marriages rather than a simultaneous polyandrous marriage. The most detailed presentation of this theory was given by Brian C. Hales in his 2013 trilogy on Joseph Smith's polygamy, which is less a history than an extended defense of Joseph Smith. To understand how the new DNA evidence demolished Hales' previous apologetic and forced him to restate his already problematic position in much weaker and highly implausible terms, I will first examine Hales' former position. Having rejected the notion that Josephine was Joseph Smith's spiritual daughter, Hales invented an equally problematic interpretation designed to avoid the conclusion that Sylvia was having sex with Joseph and Windsor at the same time. Believing that Josephine was Joseph Smith's biological daughter, Hales speculated that Sylvia had separated from Windsor after his 19th of November 1842 excommunication and considered herself religiously divorced when she married Joseph Smith for time and eternity, got pregnant, and gave birth to Joseph Smith's child. After Joseph Smith's death in 1844 and Windsor's rebaptism in 1846, Sylvia was free to resume marital relations with Windsor, at which time she had 2 additional children. Thus, Hales argued, Sylvia experienced consecutive marriages, rather than simultaneous sexual polyandry. The problem with this scenario is that Hales had no evidence to support it. The first barrier to Hales' interpretation is that Joseph Smith probably married Sylvia several months before Windsor's excommunication. While most interpreters have dated this sealing to the 8th of February 1842, which comes from the affidavit books compiled by Joseph F. Smith in 1869 and 1870, Hales has challenged this dating because it doesn't fit his theory that Smith married some of the women who were already married to non-Mormons or unworthy men to provide them with a husband in the next life, and thus, according to Mormon doctrine, ensure their exaltation in the highest degree of the celestial kingdom, although it is unclear that Joseph Smith had this theology in early 1842. Nevertheless, Hales has raised legitimate questions about the 8th of February 1842 date by pointing out that a duplicate book contains the date 8th of February 1843. In the middle of these volumes, Joseph F. prepared partially completed affidavits, stating the circumstances of Sylvia's sealing to Joseph Smith, for her to sign, with the date 8th of February 1842 in one and 8th of February 1843 in the other. However, both affidavits remained unfinished and unsigned. It is likely that Joseph F. found Sylvia uncooperative, since she didn't want to publicize the fact that she was married to Joseph Smith while being married to Windsor, which might have led to questions about Josephine's paternity. This fits with what Josephine reported her mother saying in 1882, that she desired to tell me something which she had kept an entire secret from me and from all others. While one book was clearly begun before the other, it is also clear that the two were kept simultaneously so that the duplicate affidavits could be signed by the various individuals at the same time. It is therefore impossible in most cases to tell which affidavit was written first. Hales argues that neither date is authoritative, since the affidavit was never signed and the degree of Sylvia's involvement is unknown. Hales also questions the month and day, since 8th of February happens to be both Josephine's and Windsor's birthdays. To support a later date, Hales refers to the statement in Josephine's 1915 affidavit that seems to date Sylvia's marriage to Smith after Windsor's excommunication on the 19th of November 1842. She then told me that I was the daughter of the prophet Joseph Smith, she having been sealed to the prophet at the time her husband, Mr. Lyon, was out of fellowship with the church. It is unclear if this last parenthetical phrase was intended to represent what Sylvia had said, or if it was added by Josephine or Jensen by way of explanation. Indeed, the phrase, Her husband, Mr. Lyon, seems to point to Jensen and to echo his words in the introduction that referred to Windsor as Mr. Lyon, her mother's husband. Hence, it may only represent Jensen's rationalization for Sylvia's sealing to Smith and her presumed pregnancy by him. This seems especially to be the case, since the next sentence repeats the information that she was sealed to Joseph Smith, but points to an earlier date before Windsor was excommunicated. She also told me that she was sealed to the prophet about the same time that Zina D. Huntington and Eliza R. Snow were thus sealed. Zina D. Huntington was sealed to Joseph Smith on the 27th of October, 1841, and Eliza R. Snow on the 29th of June, 1842, which is consistent with the earlier date of the 8th of February, 1842, in Joseph F. Smith's books. While the dates of Zina's and Eliza's marriages to Smith were known to Jensen, he evidently did not know the date of Windsor's excommunication. In his biographical notes on Windsor Lyon, Jensen doesn't give the date for Windsor's excommunication, but incorrectly states that it occurred in Missouri because he sued Thomas B. Marsh. His note reads, "In Missouri, he sued Thomas B. Marsh, once a member of the 12, and was disfellowshipped from the church." In fact, however, Windsor was excommunicated on the 19th of November, 1842, for violating church council by suing Nauvoo Stake President William Marks for an unpaid debt for $3,000. Jensen's insertion of Missouri was necessitated by the fact that Thomas B. Marsh was excommunicated in 1839, about a year after Sylvia and Windsor were married, and he remained in Missouri for the next 18 years, finally rejoining the church in 1857. While this allowed for Windsor's excommunication to have occurred before Smith's marriage to Zina, Eliza, and Sylvia, it was simply wrong. Unlike the statement in Josephine's affidavit about Windsor's excommunication, the link to Zina's and Eliza's marriages to Smith is directly attributed to Sylvia, but Hales weakly brushes it aside by saying, "It is unlikely that Sylvia chose to compare her plural marriage to those of Eliza and Zina simply because their sealing dates were close to hers. Instead, Sylvia knew that Josephine would be familiar with Eliza and Zina as plural wives of Joseph Smith. But why mention them if their marriages to Smith were not close to hers?" Eliza R. Snow's sealing to Smith was 5 months before Windsor's excommunication, and Zina Huntington's was a year before, being one of the first plural wives of Joseph Smith. Hale's argument that Sylvia named Zina and Eliza for a reason other than what she stated seems to require mind reading and makes no sense. Thus, it appears Joseph Smith probably married Sylvia in February 1842, or at least in early 1842. She conceived around the 3rd of April, and when her child Asa Windsor was born, the infant soon died. 5 months later, she conceived again, and when Josephine was born on the 8th of February, 1844, Sylvia believed she was Joseph Smith's child. The issue of dating will become even more crucial to Hale's defense of Joseph Smith after the DNA results. A second barrier to Hale's speculated scenario is the fact that there is no evidence to support his assertion that Sylvia and Windsor separated and considered themselves divorced. Because Illinois law allowed divorce for impotence, adultery, and desertion or drunkenness for at least 2 years, Hales admitted Sylvia's case did not justify a divorce based on those criteria. Instead, Hales argued that there was a religious divorce, although there is no evidence for that either. By religious divorce, he meant that Mormon leaders sometimes divorced and remarried people even though they had no legal authority. As Hales said in his presentation at the Mormon History Association meeting in 2016, and in his video on YouTube, "I have been soundly criticized for suggesting that in the 1840s, legal marriages might be annulled by church leaders in the equivalence of a church divorce, where all parties ignore the civil union and consider themselves free to remarry. The criticisms are unfortunate because such marital dynamics were not unusual, and were likely the most common form of pseudo-divorce in America for the first several decades of its existence. However, this type of pseudo-divorce that existed in 19th century America was nothing like what Hales imagined for the case of Sylvia and Windsor, because these other cases involved a separation of 2 to 5 years to escape prosecution for bigamy and were considered legally enforceable should the first spouse contest the marriage. In other words, this practice of pseudo-divorce complied with the requirements of the law without making it legal, which was difficult, time-consuming, and expensive. This in no way justifies Hales' speculated chronology for a maximum 6-month separation for Sylvia and Windsor before her marriage to Joseph Smith. That is, assuming, as Hales did, that they separated immediately after Windsor's excommunication on the 19th of November, 1842, and that Joseph Smith married Sylvia just before she conceived Josephine about the 18th of May, 1843. Regardless, Hales also has no evidence that Sylvia and Windsor obtained a church divorce. No case was brought before the Nauvoo High Council, which heard and tried several cases in 1842 and 1843 dealing with people who remarried without getting a divorce. After reviewing these cases, Daniel W. Bachman wrote, "Thus, it appears that men or women were permitted to remarry without divorce if it could be proven that their former spouse's conduct was adulterous or seriously marred by unfaithfulness. Windsor did not fit these qualifications. More importantly, the High Council seems to have been mindful of the 2-year separation requirement of the law. Apparently without realizing the implications, Hales referred to the case of Henry H. Wilson, who appeared before the Nauvoo High Council on the 21st of January, 1843, seeking to remarry, having not obtained a divorce from his first wife, with whom he had been separated for 5 years. The council decided that if he feels himself justified and can sustain himself against the laws of the land, that he is clear as far as they were concerned, i.e., the jurisdiction of the High Council, and was at liberty to marry again on the aforesaid conditions. This actually works against Hales' interpretation, not only because Sylvia could not fulfill the requirements of the law for a divorce, but also because it shows the High Council was concerned about those requirements. At the same time, the High Council excommunicated Thomas Thorpe for abandoning his wife and marrying Sarah Miller within the same month, and disfellowshipped Thorpe's first wife, Charity, for marrying Thomas Prowse. Hales also referred to the case of Lydia Gothwaite Bailey, who married Newell Knight in Kirtland, Ohio in 1835 without divorcing Calvin Bailey, as an example of where church leaders annulled previous marriages by simply ignoring them. However, this was not the case at all. In his video, Hales incorrectly states that at the time of her marriage to Newell Knight, Lydia had legally married Calvin Bailey 3 years earlier. Hales may have believed Lydia's case didn't meet the 3-year requirement of Ohio law, and was therefore similar to what he speculated happened in the case of Sylvia and Windsor Lyon and Joseph Smith. However, according to Lydia, she had married Calvin in the fall of 1828, but Calvin was an abusive drunkard who abandoned Lydia and her child in February 1832, 3 years prior to her marriage to Newell. In fact, Lydia needed some persuading that her marriage to Calvin was not a legal barrier to her marrying Newell. She recalled in her history that Newell explained that according to the law, she was a free woman, having been deserted for 3 years with nothing provided for her support. Rather than demonstrating Hales' theory that church leaders presumed authority to annul civil marriages, or that those previous marriages were simply ignored, this example shows a concern for and compliance with state law regulating divorce. Ignoring the 2-year requirement of Illinois law, Hales nevertheless tried to establish that Windsor and Sylvia were physically separated prior to Sylvia's marriage to Joseph Smith. Hales gives credence to a family tradition recorded in 1945 that Windsor left Nauvoo and went up to Iowa City, making his home there, but leaving his wife in Nauvoo, who apparently did not wish to leave the church and go with him. The account was related by Irwin F. Fisher, Josephine's son, who believed it must have been at this time that she, Sylvia, was sealed to the prophet, thinking no doubt that her husband had apostatized from the church for good. However, while it is possible that Windsor had other connections in Iowa City, this account is likely confused by the fact that Sylvia and Windsor moved to Iowa City in 1846 to live near Windsor's brother Ethiel, who had moved there the year previous, and that Windsor died there in January 1849. In 1842 and 43, there could be no thought that Windsor had left Nauvoo for good, since he owned a store and other property there, and was in the process of building his new brick store and residence in 1843. On the 31st of May, 1843, Windsor announced in the Nauvoo Neighbor the arrival at his store of a shipment of goods from New York and Philadelphia. According to Emmeline B. Wells, who had access to Patty Sessions' journal for this period, Windsor loaned Joseph Smith $500 on the 12th of February, 1843. Eliza R. Snow mentioned attending a gathering at Mr. Lyon's place on the 15th of April, although Hales dismissed this because she did not mention specifically that Windsor was present. Thanks to the DNA evidence, we now know that Windsor was there and still having sex with his wife. When he published his multi-volume work on Joseph Smith's polygamy in 2013, Hales was able to mention Hugo Perigo's inconclusive studies into the DNA of Joseph Smith's and Josephine Lyon Fisher's descendants. 3 years later, Perigo announced that he could finally prove that Josephine's father was Windsor instead of Joseph Smith. This was a devastating, if not fatal, blow to Hales' no-sexual polyandry theory. For one thing, it meant that Sylvia and Windsor had not separated or got a religious divorce immediately after his excommunication. It also meant that not only was Sylvia having sex with both Windsor and Joseph, but that sex with them was close enough to one another for her to incorrectly conclude Smith was the father. When Perigo announced his findings at the Mormon History Association meeting in June 2016, Brian Hales presented a paper in the same session, which he turned into a video presentation on YouTube and posted a slightly different printed version on his website that attempted to defend Joseph Smith by arguing that sexual polyandry was just one of several interpretations of the evidence, and that without additional documentation, it was impossible to come to any definite conclusion. Hales labored to cloud the issue by making it appear that, 1, much of the available evidences are contradictory, incomplete, or ambiguous. 2, that the evidence fits multiple scenarios, and that the scenario a researcher chooses will depend primarily on which documents they are willing to dismiss and which assumptions they are willing to embrace. And 3, that it is unlikely that the relationship between Sylvia, Windsor, and Joseph can be fully discerned without additional historical information. Thus, in apologetic fashion, Hales seems satisfied to leave the subject suspended indefinitely. To make it appear that there is more than one viable interpretation of the evidence, Hales, 1, revived the spiritual daughter theory that he had previously dismissed without bothering to answer the counter-arguments he had previously raised against it, and 2, attempted to salvage his theory that Sylvia and Windsor were separated or religiously divorced when Joseph Smith married Sylvia and had sex with her, by proposing a new chronology of events that is even less plausible than his previous attempt. In his Mormon History Association presentation, Hales examined 4 possible interpretations, but on his website he condensed them into 3. I will be commenting on the YouTube version of his MHA presentation and using some of his graphics for commentary purposes. A close examination of these interpretations will show that there is really only one viable interpretation and that the others are contrived to confuse. In his video, Hales described the first possible interpretation of the DNA results as follows. Sylvia was sealed to Joseph for eternity only, and Windsor was the only genuine husband Sylvia had in Nauvoo. On his website, he put it this way. Joseph's sealing to Sylvia Sessions was non-sexual eternity only, and evidence of sexuality between them is unreliable. The unreliable evidence, according to Hales, is Josephine's 1915 statement, which he now argues is ambiguous. According to this interpretation, Sylvia's 1882 statement to Josephine that she was Joseph Smith's daughter could equally be understood to mean that she was Joseph Smith's adopted or spiritual daughter. This being the case, it is possible that Sylvia and Joseph were married in an eternity-only sealing and never had sex. However, the context of Sylvia's disclosure to Josephine is clearly that she was Joseph Smith's biological daughter. There is simply no way around it. As previously mentioned, prior to the DNA evidence, Hales had argued against this interpretation quite correctly and persuasively. It bears repeating. If no biological connection existed between Josephine and Joseph Smith, it is strange that Sylvia would wait until her deathbed to dramatically reveal to Josephine that the prophet was her father only in eternity. To be sealed as one of his descendants was unexceptional. It conferred no unique or unusual status, required no special deathbed announcement, had no reason to be kept secret during most of the child's lifetime, and would not have been a matter of interest to church historians. In his new apologetic, Hales simply ignores his previous contextual argument and instead declares that the phrase daughter of the prophet Joseph Smith is ambiguous. He then tries to bolster the spiritual daughter theory by drawing on a purported statement of Josephine's half-sister, Phoebe Clark, who was born in 1852 to Sylvia and her second husband, Ezekiel Clark. In an undated statement published in the Carr Family Record and Journal, privately published in 1992, and compiled and edited by Sylvia's great-granddaughter, Sylvia Carr Wills, Phoebe appears to quote Josephine's 1915 statement and then remark that her mother again told us of our special heritage and admonished us and our descendants yet unborn to have faith and hold fast to the gospel principles. According to Hales, Phoebe equated Josephine's heritage with hers and therefore believed Josephine was also a spiritual daughter of Joseph Smith. In the same Carr family history, there is also a purported undated statement by Josephine Lyon Fisher, wherein she never mentions her mother's words to her about her being the daughter of Joseph Smith, but instead refers twice to Windsor as her father. On his Mormon Polygamy Documents site, Hale supplied scans of some of the pages from the Carr family history that he obtained from family members, without supplying complete bibliographic information regarding its compiler or date and place of publication. Yet, some researchers noticed that there was a serious problem with Phoebe quoting Josephine's 1915 statement, since the former had died in 1912. With this and another anachronism, I began to suspect that the purported statement was at least edited or possibly even ghostwritten. When a copy of the Carr family history was located at the LDS Church History Library in Salt Lake City, there was found in the introduction the following astonishing declaration of the 64-year-old Sylvia Carr. This book will not be like any other book you may have read on ancestry. I have taken liberties that you may think are unwarranted. Let me explain. I felt inspired to write their stories in first person, so as to present them with their problems and also their special blessings in an intimate way that will be an inspiration to you, their descendants. I truly felt the Spirit of the Lord helping me to put the facts that I found into words they might have written to us, had they left a written account of their lives. Certainly, Hales should have been more careful before using the Carr family history. To support the view that Sylvia never claimed Joseph Smith was Josephine's father, Hales quotes from a letter from Joseph Smith III, son of Joseph and Emma Smith, and president of the Missouri-based Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, now known as the Community of Christ, to E.C. Brand, dated 26th of January, 1894. Joseph III, who denied his father lived polygamy and liked to taunt Utah Mormons by demanding that they produce the children from such unions, happily reported to Brand, "Mrs. Lyon may have been sealed to Joseph Smith, but her testimony to E.C. Briggs gives the case away as to children by Joseph Smith. If my memory serves me right, she was childless in Nauvoo. Nothing more is known about the testimony of this Mrs. Lyon, but if Joseph Smith III was referring to Sylvia Lyon, he was completely wrong, since Josephine was born in Nauvoo on the 8th of February, 1844. How Hales thinks this inaccurate and incomplete source proves anything is a mystery. Besides, if Sylvia wasn't willing to help Joseph F. Smith in 1869, it is doubtful that she would have been forthcoming with Briggs, which is in keeping with her 1882 statement to Josephine that she had not previously discussed the circumstances of her birth with anyone. Obviously, neither Joseph Smith III's 1894 uninformed statement nor the 1992 Creative Car family history can be used to challenge what we know on more certain terms from Josephine's signed statement. The problem is that Hales is trying to overturn a primary document with third-hand accounts, which is generally not a good idea. In context, Josephine's 1915 statement makes it quite clear that both Sylvia and Josephine believed Joseph Smith was Josephine's biological father. Again, any explanation of the evidence that does not account for this fact is simply going to be wrong. In his video, Hales described the second possible interpretation of the DNA results as follows. Sylvia practiced polyandry or plurality of husbands with both Joseph and Windsor, but Windsor was absent for several weeks after he had impregnated her, leaving her to cohabit exclusively with Joseph until Windsor's return, creating Sylvia's belief that Joseph was the father. Hales' wording here is unfortunate. Of course, we know Joseph Smith didn't cohabit with his polyandrous wives, nor did he need to cohabit with Sylvia while Windsor was absent for her to believe Joseph Smith was the father of Josephine. It is unnecessary to speculate about how she came to the wrong conclusion. We know it happens all the time. We also know that Sylvia didn't practice polyandry by choosing Joseph Smith as a second husband, but rather that Joseph Smith intruded into Sylvia and Windsor's marriage by polyandrously marrying Sylvia and having sex with her. Indeed, given the fact that Sylvia was confused about Josephine's paternity, the only reasonable conclusion is that Joseph Smith practiced sexual polyandry with Sylvia. Although fraught with uncomfortable implications, Hales admits, if Sylvia was impregnated by Windsor, but at the child's birth believed Joseph was the actual father, then the span of time between her sexual relations with both men would have been days or weeks, at most a month or two. The easiest way to explain such a timeline is by assuming the relationships were polyandrous. Additionally, Hales acknowledges that his obstetrician colleagues explained that if a woman is having relations with two men and becomes pregnant, identifying the more desirable male as the father, even if other men could have been responsible for the pregnancy, is a common practice. In his video, Hales described the third possible interpretation of the DNA results as follows. Shortly after becoming pregnant by Windsor, she separated from him, being sealed to Joseph Smith and experiencing conjugal relations only with him, the marriage being for time and eternity, not eternity only. Thus, Hales changes the date from just after Windsor's excommunication, on the 19th of November 1842, to just after Josephine's conception around the 18th of May 1843. However, this new dating makes his reconstruction even less plausible. Prior to the DNA evidence, Hales had argued that if Sylvia was sealed to Joseph Smith soon after Windsor Lyon's excommunication on November 19, 1842, They may have been married less than 5 months after Eliza's plural sealing date, evidently inferring that it was close enough to justify Sylvia's association. However, it was almost a year after Zina's sealing, and now with the new chronological requirements, it is a year and 7 months. Clearly, Hales has stretched his interpretation of Sylvia's statement beyond the breaking point. Hales also previously suggested that Sylvia chose Zina and Eliza simply because they were well-known plural wives of Joseph Smith. Eliza and Zina were well known, to be sure, but so were women like Emily Dow Partridge Young, Eliza M. Partridge Lyman, Lucy Walker, and Helen Mar Kimball, all of whom were sealed to Joseph Smith in May 1843, which is the month Josephine was conceived and closer to Hale's target date. 3 years prior to Sylvia's statement to Josephine, Joseph F. Smith published the affidavits of sisters Emily Dow Partridge Young and Eliza M. Partridge Lyman in the Deseret News on the 22nd of October, 1879. Clearly, Sylvia could have just as effectively used their names if she had been sealed in 1843 instead of 1842. This later dating also forced Hales to discard the Fisher family tradition that Windsor abandoned Sylvia and went to live in Iowa City shortly after his excommunication in November 1842. Nevertheless, Hales would like Windsor and Sylvia to be at least physically separated and living in different residences until after Joseph Smith's death. To support this theory, he quotes Emily Partridge's statement about what happened after she and her sister were ejected by Emma Smith from the mansion house, sometime in the latter part of 1843. My sister Eliza found a home with the family of brother Joseph Coolidge, and I went to live with sister Sylvia Lyons. Hales argues the wording suggests Windsor was not sharing the residence of his wife at the time. However, in another source, Emily made it clear that Sylvia and Windsor were cohabiting. I got a place, or Joseph did for me, with a respectable family. The lady, Sylvia Lyon, was very kind to me, but the work was rather hard. I had to sleep in the same room with her and her husband, Windsor Lyon, in order to be where I could get up nights and tend her baby, Josephine, when it was worrisome. It is not known exactly when Emily arrived at the Lyon home, but it was probably around October 1843. Regardless, Emily's account makes it clear that Sylvia and Windsor were living and sleeping together as husband and wife only a few months following Joseph and Sylvia's supposed marriage, and long before his death. Prior to the DNA evidence, Hales had imagined that Windsor and Sylvia remained estranged throughout Windsor's excommunication, and were reunited only after his rebaptism on the 1st of February, 1846. After this, Sylvia gave birth to 2 more children, the first being born in September 1847, which, as Hales pointed out, was over 3 years after Smith's death, and 19 months after Lyon was rebaptized a member of the church. Hales thought this gap in births supported his theory that Sylvia was no longer having sex with Windsor, and therefore she experienced consecutive marriages, although there is no record of a remarriage to Windsor. Now that Josephine is known to be Windsor's daughter, the chronology of events has become more compressed, requiring Sylvia to have sex with the excommunicated Windsor about the 18th of May, 1843, separate from him and consider herself divorced within days or weeks, be sealed to Joseph Smith and have sex with him, and have Windsor return before Emily Partridge came to live with them about October. Obviously, this speculated and implausible scenario exists only to serve an apologetic need. As previously discussed, there is no evidence of a divorce, either a civil or religious one. Nevertheless, Hales refers to Andrew Jensen's note, calling Sylvia formerly the wife of Windsor Lyon, and interprets it to mean she was divorced from Windsor. How Hales gets this interpretation is a mystery, especially since Sylvia had 2 more children by Windsor after Joseph Smith's death. Windsor died in 1849, and she remarried soon after and was known as Sister Clark at the time of her death in 1882. So in 1886 and 87, when Jensen wrote his note, it was appropriate for him to refer to her as formerly the wife of Windsor Lyon. To summarize, Hales' chronology is implausible, without evidence, and is contradicted by existing evidence. It rests on nothing but a wish for it to be true. Contrary to what Hales has asserted, the evidence shows that Windsor and Sylvia continued to live together as husband and wife following her marriage to Joseph Smith, which probably occurred in February 1842. More importantly, the DNA evidence shows that Windsor was having sex with Sylvia around the same time she said she was having sex with Joseph Smith, which is strong evidence that Joseph Smith practiced a form of sexual polyandry. In his video, Hales argues that a fourth interpretation of the DNA results is the possibility that Sylvia didn't understand the restrictions of her time and eternity sealing to Joseph Smith, or she violated the covenant. The best way to show polyandry is to show that the husband was still living and sleeping with his wife after Joseph Smith married and had sex with her. But, alas, Hales has an answer to that as well. She broke her covenant with Joseph Smith and committed adultery with her only legal husband. It is a bizarre situation indeed, when an interloper like Joseph Smith is declared innocent and virtuous, while the legally married husband and wife are considered adulterous. The problem with this interpretation is that of the 14 polyandrous marriages, there is no example of Joseph Smith instructing a woman to leave her husband, or to stop having sex with him. In fact, Mary Rollins Lightner said Joseph Smith instructed her to stay with her husband. Writing to Emmeline B. Wells, "I could tell you why I stayed with Mr. Lightner. I did just as Joseph told me to do." The case of Windsor and Sylvia Lyon is the strongest evidence we have for Joseph Smith's practice of sexual polyandry. Given the reluctance to discuss sexual matters in the 19th century, we shouldn't be surprised that Joseph Smith's wives generally left such intimate details out of their accounts. While Hales acknowledges this reluctance, he nevertheless demands explicit evidence. No surprise there. Yet, when presented with such strong evidence for sexual polyandry, as the case of Sylvia and Windsor Lyon provides, which he acknowledged was the easiest way to explain the evidence, he responds by dismissing primary documents in favor of unlikely interpretations of secondary sources, creating and defending an implausible chronology of events, and accusing Sylvia of committing adultery with Windsor, which calls into question the seriousness of his demand for explicit evidence. Rather, it seems likely that Hales has attempted to defend Joseph Smith by taking advantage of an expected silence, instead of trying to provide us with a probable reconstruction of historical events. By this, Hales has shown us what evidence he dismisses and which assumptions he embraces. I hope you will join me for my next video, where I will discuss some of the other polyandrous wives of Joseph Smith. I'm Dan Vogel. Thanks for watching.